So I'm going to start. Um, Bastian, are you okay to check the chat while I do the presentation?
Yeah, of course.
Fantastic. Okay. And yeah, if you don't have links to the notes or you need any more details, then just put a message in the chat. Um, so, nothing about us without us. This phrase originally comes from the disability rights movement, and it was used by South African activist Michael Mathusa and William Rowland. But they in turn heard it from some Eastern European activists. So it's one of those phrases that has like a complicated history, but has just become a very kind of potent phrase that's used in lots of different contexts. And I'm using it here in relation to participatory research and the idea of inclusion. I think at a fundamental level, it's really about the idea that no one should be excluded because of disability, race, gender, sexuality, any of these kinds of characteristics. But beyond that, it's also about thinking about for whom is there most at stake in the work that you're doing. So if you're designing software, if you're working in research, what is it that will affect people in the world? Who are those people? And are they able to make decisions and set direction? So really centering the people who will be most affected by the work you're doing, I think is core and at the very heart of participatory research. And that's why nothing about us without us, I think, is such a useful phrase for capturing that. And I think when we think about inclusion, it's not just non-discrimination. It's beyond sort of not actively being prejudiced or excluding people. It's also encourages this sense of proactive removal of barriers, outreach, support, and solidarity. So we have to think about this as an ongoing kind of value and challenge that requires quite a lot of us, but has huge benefits as well. And within this, intersectionality is also a really vital concept because people who are in multiple marginalized groups will have their own distinctive experience that needs to be taken into account. So there's a huge number of reasons why we would want to do participatory research and include people in our research processes for whom there's a lot at stake. So I've spoken a bit, I suppose, about the moral imperative, but there are other values too and benefits. So if you involve people in the design of research software, it will serve their needs more directly because they will have directly inputted it into the design. You will create a technology that's fit for use in terms of the actual purposes and outputs that people care about. And it also fills in knowledge gaps. When you have a more diverse group of people that you're working with, they will bring to the table of things that you might not have even considered or been aware of were it not for their presence. So diversity is really important. It builds goodwill because if you're deeply involved in something and you can see that you have some power and control over the direction of that work, then you're invested in its success. So this is actually a really brilliant benefit, I think. And further from that, that then fosters these potential future collaborations and new ideas. It's a kind of very productive space in which to formulate future projects or different kind of versions of the work that you're doing that might have other kinds of impact. So involving a community in your work, I think, can provide a huge number of benefits. I'm trying to encapsulate this because I don't have very long with this phrase, you don't always know what you don't know. In fact, there are all of these gaps in our knowledge that we may not be aware of. And when you have a diverse group of people present who you are working with who are able to speak, empowered to speak, and share their experiences, this really creates a huge amount more understanding of all the kinds of complex things that you might not necessarily even envisage if it wasn't for that collaborative atmosphere. So really thinking about what you can draw from a more collaborative approach. There's all of these gaps in knowledge that we all have, every single one of us. And this is a really good way of filling those gaps. So I'm going to now share a little bit of a case study from my own research. And This is something that Bastian and Kirsty have also been directly involved with. They're the co-PIs of the project, so it's great to have you both here. So Art Spaces is a project that has been around now for a few years at the Alan Turing Institute, where we're collaboratively co-creating a citizen science platform. So this is a platform that will specifically investigate sensory processing in autism. And there's kind of two phases. So we're in like the second phase, ready to launch the platform itself. The first part was participatory research, which was very deeply working with autistic people, their parents and carers and supporters to understand what the needs of that community is, what kind of tool we need to create that is usable and that serves the priorities of the community. And then from that, we will then use that tool, which will be a website, to collect information about autism and sensory processing. So it involves the deep collaborative participatory research aspect, and then this broader scope, scaled up citizen science aspect. And there are three goals of this platform, which are to share stories and adaptive techniques with others who have similar experiences. So autistic people who use the website can go and read other people's stories, see other people who might have similar things. They might have tips or suggestions to share. And so therefore they can recognize that they're not alone, but also benefit and learn from others who have similar experiences. We want to educate neurotypical people because there's a huge amount of stigma and misunderstanding. So having this publicly available data set should help people to understand what it's like for autistic people who have sensory differences. And finally, we will collect a data set to advise organizations on how they can manage, adapt, and design spaces so they're better suited to autistic people. But really core to this has been this extensive process of building in community. And so what that means is this very concerted effort to make sure that there are multiple opportunities and pathways to involvement so that people can really be a part of the project. And also trying to move people from just a sort of shallower form of engagement where you might consult someone or seek approval of some of the work you're doing to positions where they have actual power and leadership. So we've had some wonderful volunteers who have gone on to lead core parts of the project. For example, our moderation strategies for the platform. And it's been incredible to see that growth in levels of contribution from just interest and curiosity to leadership and direction setting. So here you can see on the slides right now a list of some of the different routes to involvement that we've managed as part of Art Spaces. So that includes focus groups, newsletters, co-writing, co-presenting, co-design, facilitation. There's a huge amount of work that's gone into this, but also a huge amount that we've gained from our collaborators. And here I have a quote from one of the autistic participants that I think is really beautiful in capturing why involving a community in your work is important. So she says, sustainability of any project means a combination of old and new faces, ideas, and enthusiasm, which we have in abundance. So Sue is someone who is autistic herself, and she's also a parent of an autistic child. And she is talking about why there's a direct link between community inclusion and sustainability of a project. If you have lots of people behind the project who are then recruiting other people who are sharing interest and excitement, then you have a way of maintaining its value over time. She also helped me design these slides. Originally, they were too busy, apparently. So she was giving me tips on how to make them more accessible. So this is all of this presentation has been co-designed with community members. So it's just a very brief preamble to give you a little bit of a framing of the topic. And now what I'd love to do is to go into some separate conversations and breakout rooms to discuss some of the topics. So the first one is going to be on some of the benefits. So how has or could co-creation design benefit your own work or research software engineering in general? So we'd love to gather some ideas around that. There will be a separate conversation around the challenges afterwards. So this is more what is there to gain, and then we'll have what could come in the way of it. So I'm going to now stop sharing a screen and set up some breakout rooms. Judging by...
Maybe for the breakout rooms now, like if folks in the room could just drop off the Zoom, because then we can make sure that we don't have some breakout rooms which are
Yeah, good point.
99% people in the room and one remote attendee who is very unhappy silently sitting by themselves.
Yeah, good point. So for those of you in the room, because it seems like quite a lot of people, if you can choose somebody to be a note taker to gather the thoughts together, and we'll have a share out afterwards. So let me check the time. Right, okay.
So folks in the room, if it's not easy to see online, we have 4 tables with quite a lot of people. I think there's probably this table in the middle. It might be worth splitting into 2 groups. And I don't know, I'll let the table at the back decide if you want to kind of be like one big group or if you want to move around and sort of balance out the groups a little bit. But you 5 look really good as a group, and there's 3 over here that will welcome someone else. Yeah, so yeah, something like that. So we'll figure that out, and then we'll have 4 or 5 breakout groups here.
Great, thank you so much, Kirsty. And I'll do probably for the online session 2 breakout rooms, and then I can go to one and Bastian can go to one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so we're not going to join a breakout room on the computer. So you are discussing, and if there is anyone that can take notes, that's always really appreciated. And wave at me if you have any questions.
Do you want to be in breakout room 1 or 2, Bastian?
We do. We have just over 10 minutes for this first discussion. Good. There's a great question from the table at the back here about where to put the notes. And I think probably what to do is under the question, create a little heading that says like table M, table O, whatever you want to do. Pop your names in there if you feel comfortable, and then put yourself in bullet points underneath that. Folks, just to not really interrupt you, but what we're because there's only one breakout group online, we're just going to seamlessly move over to the second question in the Google Doc, which is about the challenges. So to be honest, you're probably already talking about it anyway, but basically the 2 prompts are around what are the benefits and what are the challenges and how might you think about addressing them. The other thing that I wanted to flag is that some of the conversations have been very focused on kind of software engineering or research software engineering. Please feel free to expand that to what fits your group, your table best. So yeah, in the Google Doc, I think about adding notes for both. Oh, our team are back. The online folks are back in the room. So we are going to do a report out. Over to you, Georgia.
Yeah, hi again, everyone. I don't know about you, but that felt like a really short amount of time for quite a complicated discussion. But we had some really interesting input. And it was fab to hear from some people who were in OLS, Open Life Sciences. I did that program myself and it was brilliant. So all of their thoughts on community co-creation was fabulous. Yeah, so I'd love to just go around the different breakout rooms, and if you could nominate someone to share some highlights from your discussion, that would be really fab. So is there anyone who wants to go first? Just raise a virtual hand or a hand in the room.
Let's go first. Super, thank you. Here we
Fantastic,
go,
thank
here we
you.
go.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Georgia.
Hi, Sophia.
Oh, amazing. That one. Hi. So our table kind of glomped the two discussion points together, which made for some really interesting discussions. We tried to break down what separated out co-creation, co-design, participation, and really understand, you know, what would benefit each project and how each project would differ potentially in its needs. But ultimately it boiled down to, it's a really great way to work. In the sense that when you're working with a really diverse group of people on a big project, you have to be flexible, you have to be inclusive, you have to think about how to design an environment and a space where people are able to share, like we're doing now. In the sense that that in its heart is one of the greatest benefits, is that you actually enjoy going into work. You enjoy the project that you're taking part in. But of course, all these kind of big projects don't come without some challenges, and getting people to care about co-design, getting people to care about giving input, changing input, going through iterations can be really difficult. And that's inherently tied to finding the right people, both from a recruitment standpoint and also ensuring that the people with the expertise are kind of in the room with you and feel able to share, and then are able to take part in something. And that challenges building that welcoming and inclusive space that people feel able to engage with. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Shall we go through the rooms in person first and then come to the online ones?
Sure, great. So yeah, anyone else in the room? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. So let me just look at the actual question. Yeah. We thought that there were lots of benefits, obviously, and we really like this idea that gaps in people's knowledge were actually an asset, because then when you get a diverse group of people, all those little gaps add up to sort of dialogue and questions, which helps build a sort of a better approach. We also said, what else did we say? That, oh, help me. So on. Yeah. So we talked about steering committees for good or bad examples of good practice. And there was quite a discussion around documentation and code being self-describing, or whether we should like make extra efforts to set the context when we're writing code, because it's useful to know who your users are and to focus your sort of, it says pipelines here, but focus your development on the end user and maybe even see how the users use your code.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Last two tables, anyone? Yeah, thank you so much.
So we actually sort of focused a little bit, especially at the beginning, on looking at learning materials and courses for people, and how you embed co-design in that. And you know, the fact of people are going to be more willing to engage with the courses that you've given them, or the tools and resources you develop for them, if they're part of that discussion to begin with. And it can be more tailored to their needs, and you're going to lose fewer people along the way, as you do with standard training, as misunderstandings, not understanding why you're doing something. And yeah, I think we had a discussion about actually how using sort of an agile and scrum based development method with this had been particularly useful, because it's a constant cycle of going back and making sure you're engaging with people.
Thank you so much. Last table. Jez, thank you.
Yeah, so we had a bit of a discussion about some of the practicalities of how this might work and sort of how it resonated, maybe the right word, with the kind of agile style workflow, the iterative process, and meeting with the people that your work affects on a regular basis. But we did then identify the danger with that in an academic culture, in an academic context, is uncontrolled scope creep. Because if you're constantly giving academics the opportunity to feedback, they will constantly take the opportunity to add on more work. Other challenges around sort of language and jargon and being able to speak in terms that your researcher understood, and understanding them and not getting sort of confused over different meanings of the same word. Different goals. Researchers, sadly, still in 2024, are expected to produce papers ideally as quickly as possible, while RSEs, we tend to want to do things properly, and unit tests and documentation, much of which the researchers are not going to care about at all. Yeah. Anything else you'd add?
That's great. So those are our tables in the room. So over to you online.
Thank you so much. Does anyone online want to share? I did say I would share from my group. So if you do want to add anything, put your hand up. I'll mute myself and let you talk. So yeah, tell me if I'm not capturing things. Yeah, so we had a really interesting discussion. One of the main things that we were thinking about, which Carlos actually brought up, was around when is community co-creation extractive? Are you, for instance, using somebody's labor for an output, especially if you can't guarantee that they're going to be remunerated? So there was this challenge around how do you kind of respect and acknowledge people's work? And Bastian gave an example of CAPTCHA, where it's this kind of version of dark citizen science, where basically you're giving over your data without even necessarily knowing that you're doing it. So there's obviously good and bad ways of involving multiple people in your work, but we also had some wonderful examples of how positive a thing it can be. Specifically with OLS, there was this interesting pathway from learning and being mentored and joining the program to then being a mentor yourself. So there's this pathway to increasing involvement, increasing leadership, and you get skills and then you upskill people. And it feels like there's this very built-in beneficial strategy. Also, working with underrepresented demographics can challenge the notion of neutrality. I thought this was a wonderful point. It can feel like you have this sort of view from nowhere vantage point where you can have this kind of neutral, objective stance as a researcher often. But when the more people, the more diverse group that you work with, the more you realize that actually there's things that you aren't aware of that you need to like listen to other people to understand. And we had examples of monthly meeting, people spreading things by word of mouth, having champions. Stephanie mentioned champions who would go out and share things. So there's this kind of growing network of collaborators, and that kind of fed into part of it, which was around sustainability. So if you can get other people excited and they get other people excited, then it can actually be a really useful way of making sure that software is sustainable, that communities can grow and maintain themselves beyond just a single project. But it felt like a discussion that could have gone on for a much, much longer. Yeah, so I'm wondering if anyone wants to respond to any of these points that were made in the share out. Is there anything people want to add to the discussion at this point?
Yep, one over here. Yeah.
So it just made me think of a thing that you get a lot, particularly in disability research, where and wider than research as well, where being affected by a particular disability is sometimes taken as a disqualification for contributing to research into that, other than as a passive subject. A non-research based example of that is that in my local council, there was some discussion about accessible parking bays, and the one councillor who was disabled and had a need for those accessible parking bays was barred from the discussion on the grounds that they had a conflict of interest. Thankfully, that was sorted out as soon as it hit the national news, but it shouldn't have ever got to the national news. So yeah, it's an open question as to how do you deal with that kind of attitude that if you're affected by this research, you can't conduct this research.
I really think there's this odd conception that if you are somebody with direct experience of something, you're inherently biased. And in fact, everyone is biased if they don't have a direct understanding of it, because they're not somebody who appreciates what it's like to live with a condition or a disability. So the idea that most of us are neutral, and then you're affected by a condition or you're in a marginalized community, and suddenly that makes you biased and everyone else still gets to be neutral, it seems like a very kind of prejudiced version of reality. So I think there are just these kind of pockets of misunderstanding and prejudice. And then the challenge is partially, how do you reframe that or combat that if that's something you're encountering? So I'm curious if anyone has ever had to like tackle those forms of discrimination or prejudice and how you've managed to tackle it.
Yeah, please. We've got someone in the room. Yeah, here you go.
Well, it's not that particular. I want to respond to Jess's example as a sort of an opposite as well, with a question where you're excluded because you're affected. But sometimes in co-creation, you also have the pressure of one person having to speak for an entire community. And then that gives it quite a big pressure. So you want to include these communities, but how to deal with that pressure then on that person.
You see online. Do you want to go next? Yeah.
Hi, I only joined partway through the session, but I was interested just to hear that point about being excluded because you're the person who has the closest experience of a thing. And coming from the citizen science world that I work in, I think that would be flipped on its head much more, in that you would be the subject specialist and, as the person in the room just said, expected to represent all people who have all kinds of disabilities. But I've done some work with some social scientists, and they use the phrase nothing about us without us. And so if you're doing a piece of work about a particular community, whether that's people with disabilities or something else, you should never do it about them without them being included. And I think that's a really useful phrase to use to kind of combat that type of prejudice.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious about, because absolutely, I think that's really important. And it sounds like these two extremes of either you have this pressure to represent everybody, which you can't do because any group of people is going to be heterogeneous in some ways, versus somehow you're biased and you can't take part and represent anything because you're somehow excluded precisely because you're most affected by something. So if you were sort of putting yourself in the position of someone conducting community co-creation, how might you take that pressure off someone to represent everybody, but still make sure that you're incorporating their views and perspective in a useful way? It's quite a tricky question, but I'm wondering if anyone has any kind of thoughts around that.
If I can just jump in, it's not my own thought because it's something that somebody else said to me once at another conference, but where you're dealing with, say, a minority group like that, their recommendation was to always invite 2 or 3 or more people that represent that minority group to your meeting. Because if you invite just one, they're still in the minority, and you know, when you're the only Black person in a room of white people, or you're the only disabled person in a room of able-bodied people, your interaction is different. And so to make sure that you're inviting multiple representatives so that you're still getting diverse perspectives from that particular group.
Yeah, one more in the hand, and then I don't know, time-wise, we might need to move on to the close. Yeah, but you go for it, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to raise the concept of like diversity tax as well. So yeah, it's a very complicated thing to sort of think about who should have ownership or who has responsibility to drive forward the conversation and the effort that's needed to, like, you know, transform a community. But yeah, just one dimension of it is that, like, it is a good idea. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. But like having more voices at the table to kind of like spread that burden, because yeah, people from minority groups have very valuable perspectives to share in these conversations. But we take on a lot of work in order to share that knowledge, and it's not recognized. And I know that we all do work day to day that's not appreciated and recognized. But like, I think being mindful and conscious that diversity tax is a real burden for underrepresented groups is you know, something to just be conscious of.
Thank you so much. Should I go back to you, Georgia?
Yeah, thanks so much. I tried to capture this in the notes. So if you want to look at the notes and make sure I've got it at least approximately right or change anything. But yeah, that point about diversity tax, I think, is a really, really good and important one, and goes back to the idea of, are you extracting labor from people? What are you giving them as a kind of reward or benefit from their work, and understanding that that is labor and not to be taken for granted. So we're nearly at the close, but I wanted to share with you all a link to a Slack. So one of the outcomes I would really love to see from this session is we have a little channel within the Turing Way Slack where we can continue the discussion and potentially even write a chapter for the Turing Way around co-creation, or start to build that together. And it's one of those things where the more collaborative, the better. So if anyone wants to join that Slack and just say hi or put in any comments or thoughts you've had, and we'd love to use your ideas from today as well in the notes to put that together. I think certainly I had this experience of thinking this conversation could last a whole lot longer than the brief time we had. So yeah, please stay in touch, and thank you so much everyone for joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
And
everyone in
maybe
the room.
firstly, you can plug your session tomorrow.
Yes, yes. Also, if anyone wants to come to the Turing Way's 5th birthday party, it is happening in the workshop tomorrow. The link to join the Turing Way is down at the very bottom of the Google Doc as well. So if you sort of pin that Google Doc, you can find it again. You can join at any time. Jez has a very important question.
Will there be cake?
There are 5 cakes tomorrow. There is a birthday cake, a rainbow birthday cake. There is a male chocolate caterpillar and a female chocolate caterpillar. Insert interesting conversation about gender there. There is a gluten-free cake and there is a vegan cake. So we have a balloon, but not very many balloons because they are not good for environmental sustainability. So we have 1 balloon and lots of streamers, and we're very excited to celebrate with you all. But thank you so much. Thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Bastian. Brilliant discussion. And agree.
Is there
it could
any
have gone on
remote
for ages.
cake? That's the other question.
Remote cake. I
Not
might
remote cake.
myself a cake because I don't want to miss out. I'm just going to buy myself a cupcake.
There's like a data protection challenge around getting everyone's home addresses in advance, and also a financial question. But yes, we're very sorry about that. But please, everyone, do come along and join us. Thanks,
you.
everyone. Have a great evening.
Enjoy the
Thanks.
rest of your days.
Well done.
Bye.
Huge thank you to the SSI team, because I feel like that was the smoothest hybrid engagement I've ever been part of.
Thank you for in-person
Yeah.
facilitating, Kirsty. It was beautifully done.